So I've been playing a lot of official competitive TF2 lately, and that's not a phrase that anyone has ever said before. But in my time playing competitive, I've been mainly sticking to the heavy. Not part of the standard 6s lineup, but this isn't standard 6s. Obviously, Valve competitive isn't really the same as community run competitive. There are no class or weapon limits of any kind here, so it's different. You can argue if it's better or worse, but it's different. Now, my usual loadout here hasn't been anything special. It's been the Tommyslav or the minigun, the sandwich, or the robo-sandwich if you want to be fancy, and the gloves running urgently or the fist of steel. But one of those weapons is not normally allowed in community 6s. That being the fist of steel. The fists of steel are undoubtedly a very strong weapon, possibly Heavy's best melee weapon overall, and one of the best melee weapons in the game. But are they really worthy of being banned in 6s? And the answer is yes. And I'm not saying that Fists of Steel are like game-breakingly overpowered or anything, especially in casual, but I do think that they are the subject of possibly the most botched nerfs in all of TF2 history. So much so that I think I would argue the current post-Jungle Inferno nerf Fist of Steel are maybe even better than they were before the nerf. And what do I mean by that? Well, we've certainly had weapons with worse nerfs, whether they be already somewhat mediocre weapons being gutted for no reason, like the Righteous Bison in Meet Your Match, or on the opposite side, when the Criticola was at the height of its overpoweredness, they nerfed it by giving it a whopping 2 seconds of marked for death after the effects end. Those would be examples of, bad nerfs. One where the weapon didn't need to be nerfed at all, and the other where the nerf completely missed the mark and barely had any effect at all. But in both instances, they were clearly trying to nerf the weapon, and in both instances, they made the weapon worse overall. With the Fist of Steel, they certainly tried to nerf it, but also somehow possibly made it better. Now, how does that even happen? Well, first, let's just take a quick look at the history of the Fist of Steel. When it was added, they consisted of just 2 stats, a 100% vulnerability to melee damage, and a 60% resistance to range damage when active. And this came out in the Medieval Mode update, by the way. Try using the Fist of Steel in Medieval Mode. But then, outside of that, they were busted in basically every other game mode. This version, of course, was the best version of the Fist of Steel. 60% resistance with no switch penalty. If you took out the Fist of Steel at full health, it would effectively take around 750 range damage to take you down. And if you had full overheal, it would be around 1,125. And that is, pretty crazy. Which is why only a few months later, they toned it down to 40% and added a universal 20% slower switch penalty. This meant that regardless of which weapon you had out, you would still switch between them 20% slower. And it's worth noting that at this time, switching weapons took 2/3 of a second rather than half a second. So the time needed to switch between 2 weapons was increased to about 0.8 seconds, which is pretty slow by today's standards. But its next change actually came in the update that lowered the switch speed. In Tough Break, the Fist of Steel swapped the overall switch penalty for a 100% slower holster penalty. So you would now only switch off of it slower. And then later, Jungle Inferno added the 40% slower heal rate and the 40% max overheal penalty. And it's been that way ever since. First, the Tough Break change was likely not meant to be a buff or a nerf per se, just a general change around the new switching mechanics that were revised in that update. Every weapon that had a universal effect on switching was updated. And now, with its 100% slower holster penalty, the Fist of Steel would take 1 second to put away rather than the 0.8 seconds between all switching. And like I said, I don't think this was necessarily meant to be a buff or a nerf specifically, just a change. And while I do like how this update kind of normalized the whole holster and deploy stat mechanic, it was this update that came with the first failure when it came to the Fist of Steel stats. That holster penalty, and all holster penalties, you can just bypass them. Like here, you just press 2 and then 1 right afterwards, and the minigun comes out as if there was no penalty at all. I'm pretty sure if you use the scroll wheel to switch, it just bypasses it automatically. If you're some kind of heathen that used the scroll wheel. And the Fist of Steel had the largest holster penalty of any weapon in the game, but as long as you have 2 other selectable weapons, you're able to bypass it completely. You can just ignore it. They wanted to increase the switch-off speed of the Fist of Steel, but effectively reduced it. Instead of taking 0.8 seconds to switch between any of your weapons, you would now switch comparatively about 40% faster. And as long as you know about this, I guess you would call it an exploit, that does include putting it away. So that's one botched change, and then Jungle Inferno brought the healing penalties. And in their balanced blog post, the TF2 team laid out the reasons for these downsides. They said, the downside of increased melee damage doesn't really come into play when it counts, example of holding a checkpoint or an objective. And when a medic is attached, the resulting pool of effective health is unreasonably large. And that's fair enough, I agree with that. The melee damage downside is a fun one, but it's not really a very meaningful one. But yet again, I think the way these changes were implemented arguably resulted in the Fist of Steel being better. And that lies mainly with the overheal penalty. For one, it is also bypassable. The Fist of Steel stats are worded pretty poorly, so I have seen some people confused about this, but the heal rate and the overheal penalty are only when active. Its stats really should look like this. But if you're being healed with a weapon other than the Fist of Steel active, that overheal penalty just won't come into play even when you take the Fist of Steel out. If the medic stops and then starts healing you again while they're out, it will be reduced, but as long as the beam isn't broken, you will keep that 450 overheal. Now, to its credit, that 40% healing penalty does seem to work completely fine. Regardless of what weapon you have out when the healing starts, it will be cut by 40% when you take the Fist of Steel out. And that includes things like dispensers too. So that part of the nerf checks out. But just because the overheal penalty is bypassable wouldn't make the Fist of Steel better. Well, except that when you could pick and choose when you want that overheal penalty, yeah, it kinda does. The mediguns specifically have their uber rate cut in half when you reach nearly full overheal. If you never reach full overheal, it just doesn't come into play. And when it comes to the Fist of Steel, it's hard to even argue that this is an exploit because it's an intended mechanic. The quick fix's whole uber rate is kinda built around that. Unless your heal target is overhealed by someone else, the quick fix will always build at its max rate. But when you use the Fist of Steel with any other medigun, you're able to freely give your medic a maxed out uber rate whenever you want. An uber charge, arguably the most impactful thing in the game, at an increased rate, with no penalty. Entire weapons like the Boston Basher kinda get their main niche off of mechanics like this. Soldiers and Delmen have to hurt themselves and waste ammo, but with the Fist of Steel it takes pressing the 3 button on your keyboard, and that's not even the Fist of Steel's main function. Its main function is the resistance. And with that 40% resistance, Heavy's effective health to range damage is increased to about 500. With max overheal it's about 750, and with the overheal penalty it's around 650. Though one thing with that overheal penalty is that it does make it so that a normal melee weapon's crit will be a guaranteed kill on you, because you got 390 health and they do 390 damage. So that's something. But also, in combat, the medigun's healing rate will be reduced from 24 health per second to 15. So, on paper, in an in-combat scenario, it would take the medic 12.5 seconds to bring a normal heavy from 1 to 300 health, and 20 seconds from 1 to 300 with the Fist of Steel. However, the Fist of Steel tend to not be a weapon that is out for prolonged periods of time. You take it out to cap a point, or to run away from a bad situation, or to more safely make it to a battle. It's not your main weapon, you're not going to be having it out for that long. And overall, while I do think the healing penalty is good, it's just not a major factor, especially when the other penalty is easily bypassed when you don't want it, and when you do want it, it helps you build your medic's uber up to 40 seconds faster. For free, anytime you want it. Anytime you're safe, just pull out the Fist of Steel and your medic gets uber faster. But also, if the Medi-Beam doesn't stop, you can keep the reduced overheal after you switch off the Fist of Steel, while also gaining back the normal heal rate. So you can maintain the 390 overheal while also having the minigun out. Of course, there is a trade-off there. You're sacrificing 60 extra overheal for an accelerated uber rate. But again, it's something you could do whenever you want, at your own will. There is nothing stopping you from exploiting this in any combination of ways you want. In fact, it's the smart thing to do. Just like by bypassing the holster penalty. Why would you not? On principle? I guess. But these changes were specifically to make the Fist of Steel worse with a medic, but if you are at all coordinated with your medic, you were able to take advantage of this so easily. And sure, there's other weapons with healer penalties, like the Back Scratcher, that can also help medics gain uber faster, but there's no way to bypass that penalty for Pyro. Okay, well, the Crusader's Crossbow can do it for some reason, but otherwise, you're stuck with that minus 75% heal rate whether it's helpful in the situation or not. The thing with the Fist of Steel is that you can pick and choose. It's the best of both worlds. Which maybe isn't what they were intending. The Fist of Steel's downsides are situational, bypassable but also helpful when you want it, and actually semi-effective. You can call these bugs or exploits or whatever you want, but the holster penalty has been like that since 2015, and the overheal one has been like that since 2017. And even if the overheal penalty wasn't bypassable, being able to gain max uber that way isn't really a bug. Or, is it? Because the Razorback got a minus 100% overheal penalty in the same update, and a few months after that, they fixed medics having an accelerated ubercharge rate when healing full health snipers who were using the Razorback. So, they were aware of this being a problem with the Razorback, but not the Fist of Steel. Did they not know? Did they, and they just didn't think it was a problem? I mean, it's a bit different, but at the same time, they don't seem to think it's a problem for the escape plan or the equalizer to help build Uber for free. They specifically changed the no healing for medics when active on the escape plan to a minus 90% penalty. And this time, it was clearly intended to be a buff, but I'm still not really a fan of it. Like, the escape plan is already a great weapon, so why does one of its downsides get to act like an upside? That seems kind of overkill. And I'm not saying that in either case it's some game-breaking thing, but weapons do need downsides. Balance helps make the game fun, and utility weapons like the Fist of Steel or the escape plan are usually going to be just better than melee weapons made for pure combat. But that's why it's so important to give these weapons actual proper drawbacks. The gloves of running urgently were changed in Jungle Inferno as well, and in my opinion, they made it into one of the best handled utility melee weapons in the game. The downsides of the previous gloves either never came into play, like the Mark for Death, or also helped your medic gain Uber faster, like the self-damage one. And yeah, sure, the current version is obviously the weakest of them overall, but one, it's still a great weapon that's able to maintain the concept of giving Heavy a big speed boost and allowing him to get to the fight quicker, and two, it now actually has a noteworthy drawback. You know, balancing. Trading health for mobility has always been a consistent design choice in TF2, and it works perfectly. The same penalty on the eviction notice, not so much, but that weapon's got different problems altogether. And yeah, like I said, most of the changes to the Fist of Steel just ended up being botched in one way or another. Even though I think that they more or less had the right idea with each of them. These changes, on paper, aren't bad. It's just that in the actual game, they don't end up working the way they should. But at this rate, it doesn't exactly look like they're ever going to be fixed, at least not anytime soon. And I even think they might even be better off just swapping those healer downsides for the inability to be healed while it's active at all. Yeah, it's a harsher downside, but it kind of just gets rid of all that nonsense. Or they could fix what they have now, I'd be okay with that too. And that's the thing, the Fists of Steel are already a really good weapon. And anyone who cares about balance should want its downsides to actually be functional downsides that ideally do not benefit the weapon more than it already needs. It already has a lot going for it. And that's regardless of whether you're playing casual or competitive, it has the same problems in both. It's just that, of course, they stick out more in competitive. But I feel like this aspect about the Fist of Steel is not really discussed very often, because I don't really see the Fist of Steel themselves discussed very often. I feel like they're a fairly innocuous weapon normally. But that part about it does kind of bug me. And I guess I had been thinking about the Fist of Steel in particular, because I have been using the Fist of Steel quite a bit lately. And realizing, like, hey, should I be able to do this? You know, switching off of it so fast and helping my medics gain Uber for free? Am I a bad person for exploiting this in competitive matches? Yes, and I do it again. Who's gonna stop me? You? Are you gonna subject yourself to Valve competitive? Yeah, I didn't think so. Well, thanks for watching. I will probably miss this year's Smismas update because I will be out of the country, so you might not hear from me again until next year. So, I'll see you next year, but either way, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons like Varric, Captain Forex, Eggox, Colonel, Probably Vinegar, Caponicus, Kelso the Pirate, Pillsman's Fox, Some Crazy Idiot, Ozond, Evil Toaster, Salt God, Lavi, Taupe, Time Consuming, Man344, Nolan46, and Melodici.